It's always good to be here among first-year students. And I'm always inspired by the questions, the ideas, the excellence that I see in each incoming class in terms of Howard University. So it's always an honor and a privilege to be in this space, to share ideas, and to think critically about texts, which is what we're supposed to be doing in university settings. This presentation always changes, and it has changed a lot for this particular year with the focus on Zora Neale Hurston's accounting of Cthulhu's life in Barracoon. And this text is, or my presentation is entitled Abandonment and Dismemberment, Something Torn and New. And I just want to start with an image of Cthulhu sitting in front of his house in Alabama. And you wonder what he's thinking. And you wonder what Cthulhu's conception of home is. Home is our theme for this particular semester. And Cthulhu says in his text, well, if you give Cudjo all the mobile, that railroad and all the banks, Cudjo don't want it because it ain't home. Captain Tim, you brought us from our country where we had land. You made us slave. Now they make us free, but we ain't got no country and we ain't got no land. Why don't you give us a piece of this land so we can build ourselves a home? It becomes very clear from this passage that for Cthulhu, home is much more than a place, although it includes that. That home is much more than material things, although it includes that. But for Cthulhu, home is something deeply spiritual. Home is not something that's just on the outside. It's also something that's on the inside. And in order to access Cthulhu's conception of home on the inside, we have to understand from the text and from this account some idea of his worldview, some idea of the conception of memory, some idea of the conception of his identity, and some idea of the conception of his relationships with everything around him. So when we try to understand his conception of home, we need to ask ourselves some critical questions of this text. What is the concept of a person in the society? That is, the component parts of the person's identity as conceptualized within that culture. What is the society's concept of the relationship between the person, that is the I, and the social context, that is the we? What is the society's concept of the person within the cosmos? And what is the society's belief on the nature of the afterlife? Because that belief on the nature of the afterlife is actually a reflection of what they believe life to be. All of these are critical questions that we need to look at when we examine and analyze this text. Because Cthulhu was dismembered from his home. And Deborah Plant uses a term in the text that was coined by a very prominent scholar, Marimba Ani, who is now in Atlanta, who spent most of her academic career at Hunter College in New York, called the Ma'afa. And the Ma'afa is the great disaster that African people have faced. The disasters on the African continent in terms of the trans-Saharan trade, in terms of the East African slave trade, and it also encompasses this particular moment that we're focusing on this evening in terms of the Atlantic slave trade. And a component part of that Kasula gives a very riveting account in this text of his experience of the Middle Passage. And this trauma that Kasula experiences, this trauma forces us to listen closely. On every page of this text, you can feel Kasula's grief. You can feel Kasula's sense of loss. You can feel the numbness. I don't want to talk. You can feel the depression. But despite this trauma that Kasula experienced in his dismemberment, you can also feel the resilience and courage of his human spirit to live a next day, to make a new generation that will witness, that will carry on the Africa that he knew. And so there are many dismemberments on the continent and the dispersion in the diaspora. But the one we want to focus on is this dispersal, this forced dispersal from the 15th to the 19th century of at least 12 to 20 million African people forcibly taken from various parts of the West African and West Central African coasts, primarily. And Kasula's story of dismemberment is centered in modern-day Benin, on the western coast of modern-day Benin, in a place called Ouida, or Ouida. And there is a political context to Kasula's dismemberment. The political context of that dismemberment is that sometimes you have a memory of what you experience, but you don't have a full knowledge of why that event happened to you. There is your context, but then there's a bigger context. And in the 19th century, the people that took Kasula, that captured Kasula, far inland in a Yoruba grouping of people, Kasula did not know, as he says in this text, he did not know any white person. He never saw them. In the account that he gave to Zora Neale Hurston, published in the Journal of Negro History, he says that his home was 19 days from the coast. was quite far inland. Oyo, the Oyo Empire, and Dahomey, the people that captured Kosula. That empire, or that state, its origins are obscured. There's a debate on whether or not the origins of Dahomey, whether or not it originated with a small group of kind of warriors along the coast, or whether what contributed to the foundations of Dahomey, whether it was a small society on the coast that was trying to protect itself from the slave trade in the early 17th century. And from the early 17th century onward, all the way up until the early 19th century, Dahomey and those groupings of people, they were vassals to the grouping of people from the Oyo state that lay to the east of them. Until Dahomey, around 1823 or thereabouts, in the early 19th century, until Dahomey is able to overthrow the Oyo to control the routes on the coast and to become more powerful as a state. But Dahomey has its own internal contradictions and complexities. Even as Kosula is taken from the continent in 1859, Dahomey is debating inside itself whether or not it wants to continue with participating in the slave trade. There is a significant faction within Dahomey that says, no, we want to go into the palm trade. And then there's a significant faction within the boundaries of the Dahomey that wants to continue this particular sordid business. But Kosula is caught up in the dismemberment because Kosula is from a small society. This is how most societies looked on the West African coast in the slave trade. Small societies that were virtually weak and vulnerable. And then when you integrate into that matrix, when you integrate conflict, sowing conflict between one group and another, when you integrate guns and weapons and iron, when you arm one group over another, when you funnel support to groups of people that are not even attached to a state to sow chaos, you get the unstable political environment where millions of people can find their way off the continent. And so Kosula is severed from his king of Tekoi. He's severed from his family. He's severed from his relatives in a very vivid, dramatic way. In his march to Dahomey, as he lay in the Barracoons, and as he experiences 70 days of his middle passage in coming to Mobile. And I wanted to bring up this particular book. This is a very important book by Sylvian Joff called Fighting the Slave Trade, West African Strategies. Because what we see from Kosula and these small-scale societies in terms of context, Kosula's society tried to protect themselves from this. They tried to build an elaborate gate, which is what you see many of these small societies doing, building fortresses or building their houses on water, on stilts, in inaccessible places, out of the way. Or in response to the slave trade, they're evolving new forms of leadership. But Kosula's society, agricultural-based, self-sufficient, is trying to protect itself by building an elaborate system of gates. And ultimately, as he recounts, tragically and ironically, someone from within his own community became complicit with Dahomey to give them the keys to unlock the kingdom of his people. But this particular text is quite important because Joph makes a lot of powerful statements in this particular text. And one of the statements that she makes is that African people weren't engaged. These aren't business deals and business transactions that African people are engaged in. Most African people, as she recounts in this text, most African people on the continent during the slave trade are victims of the slave trade, one. And second, just like Kosula and his community, most African people in these small-scale societies are trying to do everything in their power to save their people. Their people. And so there was not a Pan-African sense of identity. You are Fon, you are Igbo, you are Yoruba, you are Wolof, you are Congo. That's your center. And so all of those things begin to play in the complexities of what we see in this particular moment. And an article in this particular book also by Joseph Inikori, who is a very prominent Nigerian scholar, that talks about the struggle against the slave trade and the role of the state. And his point is that essentially the major factor that causes millions of African people to be forcibly removed from the continent has to deal with the role of the state and political fragmentation. That is, that if you have a small-scale society, you become a weaker society in the face of larger states and in the face of European advancement and resources on the West African and West Central African coast. And how do African people respond to that? And Kosula was part of a small-scale society within the context, the overarching context of Yoruba, but they were not able, they were not strong enough because, as you see from the account, is that the military within his own society was created not for offensive purposes, but it was created for defensive purposes. Which means that they didn't have a standing army. They didn't have thousands of warriors at the ready. They were trying to protect their small community. And so Joph has not only done work on that, but she's also done work on the very account that we're reading and the Clotilda in this particular moment. And she has a book on this account, on this event, called The Dreams of Africa in Alabama. And I actually urge you all to read this too. for a very sophisticated analysis. I'll go a little bit quicker here. But the title of my talk is Something Torn and New. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is a very famous Kenyan writer, wrote this book, and he says, how do we explain dismemberment? How do we explain it in the diaspora, and how do we explain it on the continent? And essentially, his argument is that memory on the continent is still there. It's still embedded in the culture. It's still embedded in the rituals. It's still embedded in the institutions. But in the formal institutions of education, the memory is suppressed. And so there begins to be a very interesting class dynamic in terms of the impact of the West on Africa, on the African continent. But in the diaspora, the assault is much more systematic. It's more long-lasting. It's generational. And so how do you recover memory from that deeper, more systematic assault? And so in the diaspora, which is our focus for this particular text, Thiong'o says that the ruptures are much more substantial. But Kasula's dismemberment is, I would say, is a hybrid of these two. Because Kasula is on the African continent, has been forcibly removed, but Kasula has not been in the diaspora for generations. Kasula has a first-hand knowledge and memory of where he came from. And so that's quite different. So what Kasula is doing in this particular text of Barracoon, Kasula is attempting to recreate his sense of home as best he can in a foreign environment. And so Zora Neale Hurston is to be commended for this text. And I got a chance to see this text yesterday in Moreland Spingarn. I went to the bottom floor of Moreland Spingarn in the archives because I wanted to see Zora Neale Hurston's handwriting. I wanted to see how she wrote it. Quite beautiful. But Zora Neale Hurston, in looking at her as a researcher and interviewer, there are hints and tips for even you as a student, as an ethnographer, when you interview people. It's very interesting to look at her in terms of this account. And it is Hurston's deep respect for Kasula's humanity. And that is with each scene, you see Hurston bringing Kasula an offering of food or a gift. And this offering is deeply African. And Zora Neale Hurston is very aware of that. It's deeply African because in sharing a meal and in sharing a gift, Zora Neale Hurston is expressing and confirming the moral values and bonds of kinship with Kasula. And so, as an interviewer, this entree is showing respect for him, which allows him to open up in ways that he may not have opened up to someone else. Hurston's respect for examining the culture. Hurston's respect for trying to capture the best she could the exact language and rhythm that Kasula spoke in. Her effort to capture the African storytelling throughout. And her respect for the obvious psychological trauma that he experienced, and in allowing him to narrate his own story in his own way. But despite the respect that Zora Neale Hurston showed, Zora Neale Hurston was reprimanded by Kossola. She committed a very important gaffe that taught her a deep lesson. And this gaffe was very early on, where she's asking Zora Neale Hurston, Kossola starts off talking about his genealogy. And he starts off talking about his great-grandfather. And Zora Neale Hurston's like, well, I don't want to hear about that. I want to hear about you. I came to hear about you. And Kossola looks at her and he says, where is the house where the mouse is the leader? In the Africa soil, I can't tell you about the son before I tell you about the father. And therefore, you understand me? I can't talk about the man who is father till I tell you about the man who father to him. Now that's right, ain't it? This is Kossola's conception of home. And it has everything to do with his worldview, with his memory, with his identity, and with his relationships. That is, Zora Neale Hurston started off by assuming an American conception of identity as an individual. I want to know about you. And Kossola is responding by saying that there is no me without this we. And this we encompasses the ancestors that went before me. It encompasses the relationship that I have with God. It encompasses the relationships that I have with my father, with my mother. All of these relationships make up who I am. And so you can't come in my house and ask me to just talk about me without talking about them. And so you see, right off the bat, Kossola is giving you a window into his worldview. And he's saying that this worldview transcends time and space. It integrates all of these various components within it. And so as a researcher, we can frame the story that we tell by the questions that we ask. But in framing that story by the questions that you ask as a researcher, you always have to respect the internal frames of reference of the people that you are studying. And that's the lesson that Zora Neale Hurston learned. And you can see from the rest of the interview how she's quite different. And in terms of exploring the impact of Africa in the New World, the impact of Africa in the New World is very elaborate all over this text. And I wanted to just highlight Sterling Stuckey. And Sterling Stuckey, this is a major African-American scholar who wrote Slave Culture, Nationalist Theory, and the Foundation of Black America. But we have to give a shout out to scholars that ground the work that we do. And this elder just passed recently. And so when we talk about narrating the African presence in the New World, not as an appendage of whiteness, not as a mirror image of whiteness, not as a direct response to whiteness, but trying to understand Africanity in the New World on its own terms with its own complexity. Sterling Stuckey is at the forefront of that particular effort. And there are other scholars like Michael Gomez, who is at New York University, that come after him in his book, Exchanging Our Country Marks. And this particular text is very important because it treats the African experience in this country with a great deal of respect, in the sense that he attempts to systematically study the African populations on the West African and West Central African coast. And then he systematically reads slave advertisements, the environment in the Americas, and he systematically charts the movement of these specific African people on the American landscape. It's a model for how you understand Africa in the New World. And you can understand it on multiple levels. And Kasula gives us a glimpse throughout this text on understanding this Africanness as it is expressed in the New World. And so Kasula says very early on, yeah, in Afiki, we always know there was a God. He named Allahua. But po Africans, we can't read the Bible. So we don't know God got a son. We ain't ignorant. We just don't know. So very interesting. And I'll give this statement before I give my comment. This comes from Zora Neale Hurston's account of her interview with Kasula in the Journal of Negro History in 1927. So this is not in this book, but this is part of her interview with him in 1927. And so she says, in this particular account, they had a dualistic belief in spirits. There was a spirit of good, Allah Ara, a spirit of evil, Allah Hadi Olile. The priest was called Ilaha. They were what we call pagans. And this is Zora Neale Hurston's commentary. They were what we call pagans, nature worshipers of the world, of the wind, the sun, thunder, and lightning. They knelt in fear before these powers with their arms crossed over their breasts. You see, throughout this text, Kasula, with his arms crossed over his breasts. This is a ritual form that he engages in throughout. Cudjoe frequently employs this gesture. Cudjoe is now an ardent Christian and is, I believe, hiding or suppressing what he knows about African religion for fear of being thought a heathen. That's Zora Neale Hurston's commentary in 1927. I kind of think a little bit differently about this as you begin to read this text. Because you ask yourself, how do people actually live their belief system? How do they live their belief system? How, in other words, how would someone live as a Christian? What would inform that? Would the pastor inform that? Would a surface reading of the Bible inform that? Will prevailing norms of the society actually inform you living as a Christian? What are the things that actually inform how you live your belief system? And so I think Zora Neale Hurston is off the mark here in terms of describing Kasula and what is going on here. Because Kasula, what you see throughout is that Christianity becomes the new container for his African experience. That is, that he is still living and trying to live like an African in terms of his memory that he knew in the things that he is doing. And Christianity becomes the new place to do that. And so there is a difference. This is a very complex point, but there is a difference between those norms and actually the moral bonds that constitute how a society expresses its own humanity. That's the thing that Kasula brings from Africa. That's the thing that helps him survive. That's the thing that he lives on. And Christianity is just another form, just like Michael Gomez and Sterling Stuckey and so many scholars have told us, is that these are just re-Africanized forms of Christianity. Or these rituals of water baptism, funerary rites, possession, speaking in tongues that you would get in a Baptist church, by the way. These things don't come from something called the Baptist church. These things come from a deep cultural experience that's emptied out into that church that's deeply African. You see this when Kasula talks about ancestors. We say in Africa soil, we live with you while you alive. How come we can't live with you after you die? So you know, we bury a man in his house. So that means for him that ancestors are not just like entities back there in time. That ancestors are a living presence that can be actualized at any given moment. And how Kasula structures his environment lets you know that he fundamentally still believes that. We see Africa in terms of the social structure in this text. We see it in the social and political culture that he's trying to reconstruct and that he came from. We see it in the roles, the traditions, the rituals, the prominent role of women and mother, the king, chief minister, elders, ancestors, priests, diviners, blacksmiths, farmers, all of these things we see in this particular text that you can make a comment on. And Kasula says this is one thing in terms of, as he says, in social structure. He don't think himself to marry with so many women. No, in the Africa soil, it the wife that go find him another wife. So now we get a glimpse of polygamy in his particular social order, and we get a glimpse that this institution is not run by men. This institution, from his conception, is run and controlled by women. And it's very interesting because as a researcher, what you believe in terms of your own value judgments matters not. What matters is that you respect the data and that you respect the internal frame of reference that you're trying to listen to understand their world from their perspective and the meaning that they attach to phenomena. That's what being a sympathetic, empathetic researcher is about. And Zora Neale Hurston makes this comment on his society in terms of governance in her 1927 article. She says the country was rather democratic. Anyone might see the king. He regularly presided over the court of justice. One of the severest tribal laws was against theft, and we can see this throughout. Such a crime was almost unknown. Why? Because you could die. Houses were never locked. Everyone worked and had plenty. All are equal before the law. Rank and wealth count for nothing. And so when Kosula is trying to recreate this governance, there's more, but I want to wind up here. But when he's trying to recreate this structure after, quote unquote, emancipation in the United States, you can see Africa all over. You can see him giving his children an African name and then a name for the American soil. And he says explicitly, I'm giving my children an African name because I don't want them to forget home. Because I haven't forgotten home. And how do you recreate home? He is trying to recreate a social order in a small way in the United States, just outside of Mobile. And he talks in parables a lot and stories, and it's very beautiful. And he says, you see fine clothes, you must not wish for them. That is, Kosula is not waiting for anyone to tell them or to tell him to live his best life. He's not waiting for anyone's permission. Please give me my best life. He's saying, if you refuse to give me what I've earned and deserved, I am going to do it myself. I am going to create my own world with my own social order, with my own laws, with my own governance. I am not asking permission to do anything. That's African town. And so Kosula, and can you imagine the horrible metaphor of Africa town being leveled and called Plateau, Alabama? Do you see that metaphor?
Plateau is the leveling, the destruction of something. You just plateau it and level it out. But Kosula is saying, yes, do what you want, but you can never kill the African spirits. And you can never kill African people. And you will never kill the conceptions that we have of home and our efforts to make sure that the generations that come after us respect that, know that, understand that, and love that. Thank you very much.